Chances are the vast majority of people who watch this episode of Unsung Heroes are unfamiliar with this car. You probably haven't seen it before, probably haven't heard of it before, and yet it seems so familiar. Maybe a resemblance to a certain white Can-Am car from 1970, a certain fan-assisted Can-Am car, and I am of course referring to the Chaparral 2J. And for good reason. This is also a Can-Am vehicle, but funnily enough, and the boxy design kind of helps with this, it's much newer. You wouldn't be able to tell because it's so boxy, but this is actually 14 years later after Chaparral made its mark in 1970. But in a funny way, it's not just the design that is so similar to the Chaparral's legacy, because although this car is not really as innovative as that car, in fact it's nowhere near, it has some interesting parallels, because the Chaparral never actually won a race, and yet it's one of the most iconic race cars of all time, often considered to be one of the most innovative cars of all time. I would call it the most innovative racing car of all time, and I know that's a bold statement, to the point where 8 years later, Brabham used the same kind of idea in the BT46B, made it one of the most successful, in terms of percentages at least, Grand Prix cars ever. One race, one win, immediately banned, 30-second victory margin. That's a pretty cool record, 100% win ratio. But it didn't just end there. The Chaparral and the Brabham then went on to even inspire a virtual race car, and that is of course familiar to any Gran Turismo player, the Red Bull, the X models. This car didn't necessarily go on to inspire a ton of other things, but in a funny kind of way, the idea behind this model wasn't necessarily a bad one, but in a much more vague sense, and I'm not going to tie it in some literal way like you can with the Chaparral. But the idea behind this car, which is often referred to as the MaRzda banana crate, so it's even got its own nickname, just like the Chaparral did. It's technically not called that. It's nicknamed the MaRzda, but it's actually a combination of March and Mazda. It's a March chassis, and March, of course, is a very well-known name in a number of different classes, not limited to just Can-Am, and Mazda, of course, goes without saying. It uses Mazda power. And yes, before you ask, Rotary power, which is pretty cool. Immediately, the car it jumped up to being cool in my books because it's bright yellow, it looks like a Chaparral 2J, and it's got a rotary engine. That's a pretty good start for an unsung hero, especially when the vast majority of people have never heard of it, and it's even got its own nickname. Seems like exactly the kind of thing that Gran Turismo would feature. But what is the story behind it? Well, the car was created by a guy called Bill Hill. He had a relatively short racing career from what I could find, and not that much success, if any. He raced from around 1984 to 1990, and this car in particular was used between 84 and 86. Now, it only ran in 4 events in that time, and it didn't do too well. The first event was in 1984 at Sears Point. It qualified 21st and DNF'd on lap 1. Not a great debut. Then, also in 1984, it ran at Riverside, qualified 15th, and finished in 8th. That's a lot better. Kind of middle of the grid, if you will, although it qualified way slower than the cars that actually came on the podium. A good 10 seconds or more off their pace. Then in 1985 it ran at St. Louis, and also in 86 at St. Louis, but in 85 it qualified 16th and finished 12th. So not quite as good a result, but it's better than a DNF, that's for sure. And then, as I said, its final race was in 1986, also at St. Louis, like I mentioned, and this last race, or at least the last that I could find, was its best result. Qualified 13th and finished 7th overall. So it's kind of an interesting ebb and flow where the first race was awful, second race was a lot better, third race was not great, last race was a lot better. So kind of up and down through its racing career, as limited as that career was. Now, combining this idea of a traditional kind of Can-Am chassis with a very simple bare-bones banana crate, as the name suggests, design with a Mazda rotary engine, of course conservatively rated at 2.6 litres, but not really, that's just the closest you can get. It's an interesting idea, not as revolutionary as something like the Chaparral, of course, but certainly one which perks up the ears of many petrol heads. Many of us love rotary engines, and for good reason, and that's kind of the very, very slim tangential connection that I make between this car and what the Chaparral did, because the Chaparral did not directly produce the Brabham. It was an inspiration, and it didn't directly have anything to do with the Red Bull. Again, it was inspiration. Likewise with this one, I'm not going to say that this car went on to inspire something like the Mazda 787B's win at Le Mans, but those cars later on just went to show that the Rotary could be capable of that. Just like how the Chaparral didn't actually win, but it was way ahead of its time in terms of using that kind of technology. Now, this wasn't the first race car to use a rotary, but the guy behind it, Bill Hill, certainly had the right idea. The 787B won Le Mans with a rotary engine, so the proof was there. It just hadn't happened yet. So, again, it's not that he had a bad idea. Combining a Can-Am chassis with a Mazda rotary engine, I think that's a great idea. It just unfortunately didn't pan out all that well. Maybe the car wasn't quite powerful enough or torquey enough. Maybe it was a little bit overweight or didn't have enough downforce. It's fairly difficult to find specs for the car. You can only make conservative guesses from what I've seen. But it's a car with an interesting, short, and not particularly successful history that, although it didn't really revolutionize anything, it's just one of these episodes of Unsung Heroes that I think the car deserves more attention, because it's one of those vehicles that you could definitely imagine being featured in Gran Turismo, because they do often show love for these kind of cars, these unsung heroes of motorsport history, especially games like Gran Turismo 4, where we started to see Gran Turismo do that with the Chaparral 2J and some others as well. So for me, this was just an episode for a car that I think is pretty cool, that more people deserve to know about. The driver, incidentally, Bill Hill, went on to race in 1990 in the SCCA World Challenge in a Mazda RX-7, funnily enough, but also didn't do particularly well. So it's a story of the driver and the car not having that much success, but that doesn't mean that you can't still think of it as a cool car and a cool guy for having the idea. So show the car some love, of course, talk about it more. That's the whole point of the series. Make these cars more well known. Give them that kind of chatter, really, that they deserve. So that's it overall for this particular installment. Of course, you can click here on screen to see others in the series, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.